Aaron Burr will often tell people he preferred the role of state delegate. Amazingly, he changed American politics more from New York than the United States Senate, and he always maintained that his state delegate work allowed him to do it. It's from this seat he's going to make a bid for the nation's highest office, and yes, he will come within a breath of the presidency. On this week's History of Losing, Buried Alive. Episode 4, How to Gain a Vice. So we pick back up in 1798. Aaron Burr is back in New York State politics, and the capital at this point has moved from the city to Albany. And his time in the legislature is much more involved than his last stint. As soon as he returns, he starts laying the groundwork for his next moves, starting with financing future campaigns. And this is the story of how Aaron Burr skillfully created a bank you're pretty familiar with. Chase Bank, or JP Morgan Chase as it's known now. You know it, and you probably use it, but what you don't know is that it took political and opportunistic work from Aaron Burr to create it, and that it also has a bit of a sordid past. It starts with a water crisis. Now, in 1798, at the height of yellow fever, it became apparent to everyone in New York City that one of the sources of the deadly disease was the water. At this time, there was little to no drinkable water in New York City. People relied on wells, and some historians argue, and probably rightfully so, that alcohol had a better effect on the health of the people of New York than the water. During that summer of 1798, the specter of death hung over the city. Yellow fever was rampant, and the contagion spread across the city. This disease saw no social boundaries, it had no financial boundaries, and people who felt susceptible and weren't essential personnel to the city left, leaving it as part of a ghost town. But the New Yorkers who stayed behind had no choice. They had to keep drinking the water. So Aaron Burr proposed that the state commission a water company, and that water company would haul fresh water from up north and bring it down to the heart of the growing but sickened city. Now, on the surface, this looks like a very noble gesture, so noble that even his rival Alexander Hamilton agreed it must be created. But as is so often with Aaron Burr, his true intentions lay somewhere under the surface. Now, in the center of this, there is a financial concern. This isn't all about water. You see, at the time, in the state of New York, there were two banks. You had the local branch of the Bank of the United States of America and the Bank of New York. And both banks were started by, who else? Alexander Hamilton. I get it. It doesn't seem like a big deal. It's just a bank. And in history, we learn that Hamilton's banks successfully financed a very young nation. But given the creation and the history of the two banks, they leaned pretty heavily Federalist, to the point where they may have been pretty corrupt. When looking through some of the ledger sheets, history books show that bank directors gave loans to Federalist leaders for questionable purposes, even some degree of malfeasance involved in these loans. But let's say you leaned Republican, a merchant, or let's say a sympathizer, even cash up front couldn't get you a loan. And that might seem unfair, questionably even criminal, but certainly not earth-shattering. But think about the deeper ripple effect. At the time, only landholders could vote. If you wanted to buy land, you needed money. If you didn't have money, you needed a loan, and that's the point. The only voters coming online in New York during that time were controlled by the bank. So, you make your own bank, right? How? The Federalist legislature's not going to support the creation of a bank that offered loans to a rival party. Essentially, Hamilton's banks had created and were continuing to create a one-party system. So back to the water company, or the Manhattan Company as we're going to know it. Burr's legislative moves in the creation of the Manhattan Company are both insidious and ingenious. It's probably the most commonly associated description of him, insidious and genius, because here's what he did. It starts with a relative of Burr, a doctor. He submits a report to the New York Common Council demanding they do something about the water situation. The council, listening to the outcry, agrees. But they ask for a municipal water system. That's going to go against Burr's plans. His must be private. So he spurs into action. He creates a commission of 6 men. That includes both himself and Hamilton, so it's half Federalist, half Republican. This committee of esteemed men presents the Common Council with their views on the creation of a private water company. Guess what? They're all in favor of it. Carefully selected, and that's probably why they came to that conclusion. But whose name appears on the top of the document? Alexander Hamilton. Flattery can take you very far, Aaron Burr. Now, the council votes unanimously to ask the legislature to sign off on a private company. They've seen the document and they believe that a private waterworks is the way to go. And that goes to the legislature, and one of the voting members in the legislature is Aaron Burr. He pushes the bill for a private water company through the lawmakers, but at the last minute, as the agreed upon bill is about to hit the floor, he adds a line called the bank clause. It's complex, but essentially it allowed the water company to use leftover funds to set up a bank. And this clause goes unnoticed in both houses of the legislature, and it passes. In fact, only one person is documented during the trip from bill to law to actually bring the clause up. Just one! Nobody seems to care. When it becomes law, immediately the bank function starts. Now, there is always a leftover fund amount in some capacity, and with that, there's now a new line of capital and credit for Republicans. Democratic Republicans, but for simplicity's sake, let's call them Republicans. They can finally loan, which means they can finally get more voters and expand their influence, and the election of 1800 is just around the corner. So, I understand how this looks. Burr uses a crisis to create a political opportunity, but I want you to really think about it. The banks created by Hamilton gave a federal and state-sanctioned loaning mechanism to grow the Federalist Party. Yeah, it started with a crisis that they had to deal with, the fallout of the Revolution financially, but it ended as a puppet of the Federalist Party. So, is the Manhattan Chase Company really any worse? I don't think so. Well, now what? How do you go from being the creator of the Manhattan Chase Water Company to the Vice President of the United States? To do that, Burr has to do something completely unheard of. He's going to make a promise to bring New York, Hamilton's beloved home, the capital of federalism, somehow into the Republican fold. And this, he believes, rightfully so, will bring him within a breath of the White House. But how do you do that? You're just one man, and you're a state delegate. In our view, a state delegate isn't much. I mean, I wouldn't expect you to vote for the person who currently represents your state house district for president. But in 1799, that's not exactly how it was seen. Aaron Burr was a household name. We don't even really realize it, but 3 years earlier, he received 30 electoral votes for the presidency. That was good enough for 4th place. So he's had that taste of national success to a degree, and he wants more. And by 1799, he's going to use that delegate role to maneuver himself for a seat at the national table again. Let's take a quick look at the political landscape at the time. The country had 138 electoral votes from 16 states. 12 of those came from Burr's home state of New York. And remember, the runner-up of the Electoral College vote becomes vice president. At the time, the electoral vote came from the legislatures, not the people. So if your party has a majority in the state house, your candidate won the state's votes. It's not exactly election by the people, it's several layers removed. So really, the election of 1800 would start in the spring with the election of a new General Assembly, and they would cast the vote for 1800 in the fall. So, for a Republican to win New York, the State House must become Republican, and who is also running in the State House at this time? Aaron Burr. And I'm sorry to keep asking questions that you know the answer to. To do this, beginning in 1800, Aaron Burr is going to turn politics from a rhetoric game played out in the papers to a tactician's battle. He'll create the first political machine, but before he does that, he has a plan. So he travels to Philadelphia to share that plan with a very stoic Thomas Jefferson. This is one of their first big interactions. Now, Jefferson doesn't say much according to notes in history, but it is our understanding that they came to an agreement whereby Burr will be voted for vice president if he brings New York from the Federalists to their camp. So, how is he going to move the needle? I keep asking the question. At that time, elections were decided in the papers by rhetoric and public speeches. People were supposed to be swayed. It's just very little of that grassroots groundwork. But Aaron Burr changes that. He knows that Republicans will win West New York State. It's rural, it's a foregone conclusion, it's going to go Republican. But the city itself, New York City, is a Federalist stronghold. And how do you split the stronghold? Well, you need a little help. And that comes from a divide that's already growing within the Federalist Party on a national level. Do you see? Burr looks at the political landscape as chaos, but from that chaos, he sees opportunity. At 1799, John Adams is a Federalist president, but he has strong disagreements with the chieftain of the Federalist Party, Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton is always causing controversy within his own party. It's something the musical never covers, and I bet there's just no way to write a good song about it. Hamilton wants someone else at this point to run in Adams' place, and Federalists don't know what to do. Do they go along with this party leader? Do they go along with the president, who is supposed to be the leader of the party? And that confusion filters down to a state level. So you have a rift in the Federalist Party, and that creates the opportunity for the Republicans. Hamilton may not even realize it until it's too late, but in 1800, he is again competing with Aaron Burr. And this is how state elections worked. Both parties will release a roster of candidates for delegates to the State House. Burr keeps his roster close to his vest, and he looks for people to put on there. He stacks it with well-known, influential men who can cross party lines, and he adds a name from each of the families of the New York Alliance: a Clinton, a Livingston, and one Burried. That's the nickname of his followers, Burrites. So when Hamilton releases his roster, it's actually a bunch of no-names. It's almost as though he's just expecting voters to vote for them because they're Federalists. Hamilton feels the state is so strong, what does it matter? But not Burr. Upon seeing Hamilton's list, he is said to have pronounced, quote, "Now I have him, all hollow." And he's right. Because with this information, Burr gets a roster of every voter in the city, and he decides to visit each one. He and a group of his followers go door-to-door canvassing. What a novel concept at the time. They raise money, they create the modern-day political campaign headquarters inside his home at Richmond Hill. And look at this, it's the same framework that we use today. We practically have modern campaigning because of Aaron Burr. And the grassroots, door-to-door movement, that all started right there and is still effective today. Now, Federalists hate this plan. Here's a quote from a Federalist paper on Burr. How could a would-be vice president stoop so low as to visit every corner of the state in search of voters? Kind of really puts into perspective what they're doing at the time. So it's no surprise that Burr's ticket sweeps Federalists out of office. All the pounding the pavement for votes works, and it still does today. Door-to-door canvassing is the most effective form of politicking out there. For the first time, Republicans have a majority in the New York State House, and Hamilton loses his mind. First, Hamilton begs outgoing Governor John Jay to pass a law transferring New York's electoral votes to a state referendum. Suddenly, the man who is so in favor of removing the vote from the people is a big fan of democracy. That's how important this election is. He completely switches sides. But Burr knows he has Hamilton where he wants him, because Burr's next stop will be the vice presidency if it all goes according to plan. And after Jefferson, Aaron Burr will be New York's first president. Imagine the envy on Hamilton's face. It's no wonder that from this point on, he continues to slander Burr every day in the press. At the peak of his power, Burr will be within a breath of the presidency, and ironically, it's also when his demise begins. And it all starts at the Republican National Convention. On May 11th of 1800, the Republicans meet in Philadelphia to nominate their candidates for the fall election. And at this point, it's not really a convention. That's a pretty generous term I've used. It's more of a meeting, and its sole purpose is to organize a way to have a Republican president and a Republican vice president. In previous years, if you didn't know, the general election was a runoff. Electoral college voters voted for two candidates, and the president was elected by the most electoral votes, and his lieutenant is whoever comes in second. And that's how Jefferson, though ideologically and fundamentally opposed to John Adams, serves as vice president. Determined to avoid this, the Republicans hatch a plan. Their electors will vote equally for both Jefferson and Burr, and the thought is one of the electors will drop Burr and slide him into second easily. Problem solved. And that fall, when the election ends in 1800, Republicans obliterated the Federalist Party, and a Republican will be president. There's only one problem. Who? See, all 73 Republican electors voted for Burr and Jefferson identically. Not one person dropped Burr from their ballot, so neither was president. They were tied. And a tie for president by rule would be decided by the House of Representatives. There's no sweat, Jefferson thought. He would be elected by the House. That was the plan of the Republican Party. But what happens next has now become group thought of basic history. People believe, and I'm going to argue this heavily, that Burr attempted to steal the election. But when we look into what happened just before the tie was announced, I think you get a better view of why events played out the way they did. Prior to the votes being counted, we find this interesting correspondence between the two tied would-be presidents. Jefferson writes to Burr, lamenting the fact that Burr's skills as a statesman will be underused as vice president. It's a bizarre letter filled with flattery and apologies, and it's almost as though Jefferson has tried to prepare Burr for a possible loss in the vice president race. A possible double cross? We don't really know. But Burr's response, he offers to Jefferson the idea of he himself dropping from vice president to serve in a different role and help in a way that better suited him. Now, Jefferson never takes him up on this offer, and it's interesting because the letters show a very paranoid Thomas Jefferson contrasted with a gracious and humble Aaron Burr, who would serve in a different capacity if Jefferson wanted it. But back to the tie. Aaron Burr will go on to say publicly he does wish to be president at some point, but he's also going to say he wants the House of Representatives to support Thomas Jefferson. That's not good enough for Virginia Republicans. They demand a promise of resignation should the vote not go their way. And to a gentleman like Burr, that's the equivalent of saying, I'm not suited to be president. It's a pretty simple rationale that I think historians overlook. If you're Burr, let's say, no, you don't want to win the presidency, but a majority of your peers offer you the role. Do you then respond with, no, I'm not suitable to be commander-in-chief? Who would ever vote for you in 1804 or 1808? The only way out is to openly say, no, Jefferson and I have a deal in place, so I'm not going to take the presidency. You don't think that sounds like a conspiracy to all the early voters? Now, it might be hard to believe from ancient platitudes, but all politicians are immensely prideful, and our founding fathers are really no different. In fact, many George Washington historians remark that his family burned letters that painted him unfavorably, and that's the case with nearly all of them, especially Alexander Hamilton. But consider that each founding father spent pages of editorials denying roles and feigning interest in the lead role. And then, in a strange twist, each reluctantly changes their minds, and the founding fathers from Washington to Jefferson take upon them the burden of the presidency that was thrust upon them, like Caesar of old. Burr is very different. Here's where things get messy. Jefferson and Burr had no formal agreement. You had Burr promising to deliver the North to Jefferson, and then Jefferson writing him a letter the day of the vote. Not after, the day of the vote, to say his influence as vice president would be minimal. Almost seems like a double cross there. Burr makes an ambivalent pivot. He writes a letter saying he's not seeking the presidency, but he's also not going to resign if chosen. Thomas Jefferson takes this as an act of treason. At the same time, there's movement in the Federalist ranks. The idea of a better Burr than Jefferson starts to take root, and that rage pours through Alexander Hamilton and into his pen. Now try to understand the gravity of what's happening here. The idea of Federalists voting for the rival of Alexander Hamilton, that's catastrophic to Hamilton. The leader of the United States is undoubtedly the leader of whatever party he represents, and that would mean that Aaron Burr would literally take over Alexander Hamilton's party, and the rage in Hamilton becomes white hot. You can read it in a number of newspapers across the country at that time. Hamilton despises Jefferson, but when you read his writings, he urges Federalists to vote for him. He calls Burr profligate, basically wasteful and in debt both economically and morally. And then he writes about the lack of conviction in Aaron Burr, how the colonel stands for nothing but ambition. There's that line again from Lin-Manuel Miranda's play. Yet, for all his work, and that song from the play gets this part of history explicitly wrong, Hamilton is largely ignored. No one turns to him for his opinion, and the musical should probably take note of this, because this happens next. Leading up to the House vote, after all those editorials and please, Alexander Hamilton, we want your opinion, Federalist overtures to Burr increase. They don't go down because of some editorials of a now neutered party leader. Multiple Federalists ask him by letter to abandon Jefferson and push for Federalist views. In fact, a Federalist paper, a paper that has the backing of Alexander Hamilton, called Burr, quote, an ardent devotee of liberty and a mind fast, liberal, and comprehensive. A Federalist paper wrote that. Does that really sound like a party that's turning to Hamilton to see what they should do? The pressure is rising, and Jefferson wants Burr to announce he will resign. You can feel the paranoia in Jefferson's personal record, his anas, when he writes that Burr told a Jefferson surrogate he intends to be president. But we have no evidence of that. That's just hearsay. For all the speculation, however, though, I guess it probably comes from the fact that we have nothing from Burr. He doesn't keep a diary, and his correspondences are only with his married daughter, Theodosia, and they're pretty vague. It's just him encouraging her to continue her education. And what we have are the impressions he left behind, impressions that seem to be shrouded in mystery. And here's what we see. As the House vote approaches, Burr doesn't leave Albany, and he doesn't campaign for himself in the new nation's capital. He receives several letters from Federalists saying Maryland, New Jersey, and New York will all go for him if he agrees to take on Federalist views. Yet he stays in the state capital and does no politicking. Despite his lack of an answer for Republicans or Federalists, the deadlock doesn't break for 35 votes, and each time Jefferson gets 8 states, Burr gets 6 with 2 undecided. On the 36th vote, it is Jefferson, not Burr, who bends to the will of the Federalists. He promises to take on some of their issues if Delaware comes to his side. Here's your interesting question. Could Burr have become president? Most people think if he had done half the work, or just any of the work that Jefferson did campaigning in D.C., he might be the 3rd president of the United States. Federalist Congressman James Bayard of Delaware said of Burr afterwards, and this is a quote, "Had Burr done anything for himself, he long ere would have been president." Burr then assumes the mantle of vice president, but what I'm sure he doesn't realize, because he's a little bit oblivious to things like this, is the damage his indifference has done. Federalists thought he lacked any ability to be a leader for them, which he's fine with, but the Republicans felt he tried to steal something that wasn't his, the presidency, and they will abandon him. And that is the price of 1800. Rising to the vice presidency begins the descent of Aaron Burr's political life and the end of Alexander Hamilton's actual life.